It is one of the earliest and most obscure U.S. Army operations of the Second World War, a mission so faintly recorded that for decades, it survived only as a rumor among intelligence historians. In the chaotic weeks following the attack on Pearl Harbor, as the United States scrambled to secure its overseas presence, a small and largely unacknowledged detachment, known as Task Force 561, was activated under the Army's Military Intelligence Division. Their objective was simple in wording but dangerous in execution: move quietly across collapsing diplomatic outposts in the Pacific and retrieve, secure, or destroy any sensitive materials that could aid enemy intelligence. By January 1942, U.S. officials understood the scale of the disaster unfolding across Southeast Asia. Embassy staff were fleeing Manila, Rangoon, and Singapore as Japanese forces advanced with stunning speed. Within these offices existed communications codes, cipher machines, personnel rosters, and confidential diplomatic cables, materials that, in the wrong hands, could reveal American strategic intentions. Task Force 561, composed of signal specialists, intelligence clerks, and a handful of combat veterans, was given barely a week of preparation. They deployed without fanfare, their names sealed within internal Army correspondence that offered only vague descriptions of their movements. Their first known stop was the American legation in Manila, where Japanese artillery grew louder by the hour. What little is documented suggests the team worked through the night, burning surplus files and transporting locked metal chests onto a waiting minesweeper. A surviving diary entry from a naval officer simply reads, "Army men arrived late. No insignia. Removed crates marked state. Would not say what port's next." Such brief notes are all historians have to connect Task Force 561 to the Manila evacuation. The real challenge emerged as the team moved deeper into the Pacific, tracing retreating American footprints across territories, falling one by one. Reports hint at a secondary mission: intercepting any material left behind by Allied civilian contractors or U.S.-affiliated companies. These were institutions whose abandoned documents, engineering schematics, personnel logs, or communication fragments might reveal information Tokyo could exploit. But even these references appear only as thin fragments buried in after-action logistics summaries. Insight into their operations comes primarily from a 1946 Army memorandum discussing records that vanished in transit. Although the memo avoids naming Task Force 561 outright, it describes a classified shipment that departed Surabaya aboard a Dutch transport vessel in early February 1942. The vessel, attacked weeks later during its retreat toward Australia, sank with most of its cargo. Some historians theorize this load belonged to the team, meaning the very materials they risked their lives to secure may rest on the ocean floor, lost to both Allied analysts and the enemy alike. As the Japanese advance tightened, the mission grew more desperate. In Java, the team reportedly split into smaller groups, each tasked with clearing specific consular sites before they could be overrun. One intelligence note from the period mentions rapid destruction in Shilajap under shelling, suggesting that at least one element of Task Force 561 carried out its assignment while the port city was already being bombarded. Yet no personnel lists were ever attached to the note, and official Army rosters from the time show no unit by that name, adding to the ambiguity of who these men were and whether all of them made it out. It is this silence in the record that creates the central mystery. No final report has surfaced. No commendation orders were issued. The mission disappears from the historical ledger as suddenly as it entered it. Given the stakes, retrieving American cryptographic materials during one of the most precarious moments of the war, the scarcity of documentation raises unavoidable questions. Was the mission's secrecy purely bureaucratic? Or was it deliberate because of the content they handled? Modern intelligence scholars draw lessons from Task Force 561's story. In fast-moving conflicts, the safeguarding of information can be just as vital as troop movements or supply lines. The collapse of diplomatic fronts often leaves behind a trail of vulnerable data, and the actions of small, obscure units can shape the broader intelligence picture for years to come. Yet one lingering uncertainty remains. Several sealed storage lists from 1942 include crates labeled simply "recovered," origin undefined. Analysts cannot confirm where they came from, who delivered them, or what was inside before wartime processing removed their contents. Whether these crates were the final traces of Task Force 561 is still unknown. And so, the mission ends where the record falls silent, with a handful of cryptic notations, a sunken cargo, and a disappearing unit whose work shaped the intelligence landscape of America's earliest days in the war. What happened next to the scattered teams of Task Force 561, and which of their actions remained hidden, leads directly into the next forgotten operation, deep in the Burmese frontier. Before they became legends, the men of the 5,307th Composite Unit, later known as Merrill's Marauders, fought a quieter and far less documented battle in the dense, sweltering jungles of northern Burma. This was months before their formal campaign began in 1944. Buried in pre-operational records is a detached reconnaissance group, a formation of fewer than 30 soldiers, whose disappearance still lingers as one of the earliest mysteries tied to the unit. Their task was to probe Japanese supply routes along the Tanai River, gathering information vital for Allied planners attempting to halt Japanese reinforcements flowing toward Myitkyina. Officially, this mission barely exists on paper, but scattered references indicate it was one of the most dangerous ventures undertaken by the early Marauder volunteers. The men entered a landscape that tested every sense. Burma's northern jungles, dense, humid, and alive with insects, swallowed sound and movement. Trails dissolved into vine-choked ravines with no visibility beyond a few feet. Japanese patrols from the 18th Division roamed the region, watching the waterways that served as their logistical arteries. For the reconnaissance team, stealth was their only protection. They advanced with minimal equipment, carbines, rations, fold-out maps copied from outdated British surveys, and a hand-cranked radio that often failed in the thick canopy. The challenge was brutal. Even before encountering the enemy, the jungle itself became a foe. Heavy monsoon rains turned the riverbanks into mudslides that erased footprints and landmarks alike. A corporal from a nearby British Chindit column later wrote in his diary, "You cannot hide in Burma. The jungle hears you long before the Japanese do." The Marauders' reconnaissance men would have understood this perfectly. They trained for silent movement, but the terrain punished every misstep. The oppressive heat dehydrated them, leeches clung to their legs, visibility plummeted to mere meters. Every hour spent near the Tanai River carried the risk of detection or environmental exhaustion. Historical context reveals why this mission mattered. In late 1943, Allied command under General Joseph Stilwell prepared for an ambitious offensive aimed at retaking Myitkyina's airstrip, the key to reopening land routes into China. Japanese supply boats, often disguised as fishing craft, moved ammunition and food along the Tanai under cover of foliage. Cutting these routes required detailed intelligence, river depths, patrol schedules, and potential landing zones for future operations. The missing reconnaissance team was supposed to deliver that information before the main offensive began, giving the Marauders a chance to strike decisively. Yet the documents describing their departure are frustratingly sparse. A page in the unit's early field log mentions only detachment sent upstream for advanced survey. Expected return 96 hours. No roster is attached. No equipment list is included. The next log entry jumps to unrelated supply notes, as if the detachment simply disappeared from administrative memory. For decades, historians debated whether this omission was accidental or intentional, a clerical oversight or an indication that the mission went catastrophically wrong. Secondary accounts offer faint clues. Burmese villagers interviewed years later spoke of a small American patrol seen moving west along a narrow tributary, led by a sergeant fluent in basic Burmese phrases. They carried light packs and traveled with urgency. Another testimony from a former Kachin guerrilla serving with the OSS Kachin Rangers described hearing distant gunfire near the river around the same period. He recalled finding spent American .30 caliber casings weeks later in an abandoned clearing. But no bodies, gear, or dog tags were ever recovered. The reveal emerges from a declassified 1945 memo referencing a lost forward patrol whose intelligence failed to arrive in time for operational planning. Though not explicitly tied to the Marauders, the timing aligns with the missing team. It also notes that Japanese documents recovered after the war described an engagement with an unidentified Allied element near the Tanai, an encounter the Japanese themselves treated as minor. Their report listed no captured equipment and no confirmation of enemy casualties, leaving open the possibility that any surviving Americans fled deeper into the jungle. Modern analysts reflect on the implications. Reconnaissance missions like this were essential for guiding larger Allied operations. When a small unit disappeared, so did the intelligence it carried, information that could have changed logistics, routes, or timing. Some speculate that the absence of river data contributed to several early setbacks during the Marauders' subsequent push through Burma, including navigation difficulties that cost them precious days and supplies. In this light, the missing patrol becomes more than a footnote. It becomes a silent factor influencing the hardships that followed. As the war moved forward, the disappearance faded from immediate concern. The Marauders' legendary achievements overshadowed the sacrifices of lesser-known detachments whose stories remained buried in incomplete logs. But questions endure. Why did no formal inquiry appear in the record? Were the patrol members written off due to operational secrecy, or because their fate was simply too uncertain to document? Were they ambushed, lost to the jungle, or victims of capture that went unreported? The trail ends abruptly, just like their mission did. All that remains are scattered notes, distant recollections, and the knowledge that somewhere along the twisting waterways of northern Burma, a small team vanished without a trace. Their absence casts a long shadow over the next forgotten operation, one launched far from the jungle, but burdened by a similar weight of secrecy and loss. In the spring of 1944, deep within the icy mountains of German-occupied Norway, a little-known American-led OSS operation unfolded under the codename Operation Ripe. Today, the mission is remembered, if at all, for its final acts of sabotage. But buried beneath the official accounts lies a quieter mystery, the fate of the insertion force that never reached its destination. Before Colonel William Colby and his Norwegian-American ski commandos succeeded in crippling German troop movements, a preceding U.S. insertion team attempted the same approach weeks earlier and vanished into the snowbound wilderness with almost no surviving documentation. The mission began with an unusual sense of urgency. By early 1944, Allied intelligence revealed that German reinforcements were moving by rail from northern Norway to bolster collapsing fronts in Finland. These routes, carved through mountainous terrain, were perfect for sabotage if a small force could reach them. The OSS, still young and evolving, saw an opportunity. They assembled a group of Norwegian-speaking American soldiers from the 99th Infantry Battalion, separate, men trained in skiing, demolitions, and clandestine operations. Their objective: land safely in the mountains near Snæsa, then cut critical rail lines used by the German 20th Mountain Army. The tactical challenge was immense. Winter storms could swallow an aircraft in minutes. The landing zone, nothing more than a frozen plateau, was only roughly mapped from British aerial reconnaissance. The Luftwaffe maintained unpredictable patrols along northern Norway's air corridors. And the team's aircraft, a modified B-24 Liberator, would need to cross hostile territory in near darkness with no guarantee of a safe return. A surviving fragment of the pre-mission briefing captures the risk. Insertion to be attempted in storm break. Expect cloud banks. Navigation uncertain. Even the operational planners understood that this was far from a routine drop. Yet the need to disrupt German troop flow outweighed the danger. The team departed from Scotland in mid-March 1944 under strict radio silence. The struggle began almost immediately. Weather reports from RAF Coastal Command describe a sudden pressure drop and fast-moving snow fronts building over central Norway that same night. The Liberator's crew likely fought violent updrafts and whiteout conditions so severe that the aircraft might have been forced off course. Norwegian locals would later recall hearing an engine roar over the mountains, lower and slower than any Luftwaffe patrol, followed by an abrupt silence. But no official German or Allied report confirms a crash site that matches those accounts. Insight into their possible fate comes from a handwritten note recovered in 1946 from OSS archives. It references one aircraft overdue, presumed lost en route to Snesa sector. The note includes no names, no tail number, and no follow-up. The phrasing suggests deliberate concealment, a common practice in OSS operations where mission failures were often minimized to protect ongoing activities. A U.S. after-action report from later in the WWII campaign mentions only that a revised insertion method had been required, an indirect acknowledgement that a previous attempt had gone wrong. Yet the physical evidence, or lack thereof, deepens the mystery. Post-war search teams combed the region, but found no wreckage. The mountains in that part of Norway shift every winter, burying debris under meters of snow and ice. Whole aircraft have been known to vanish for decades before reappearing. It is plausible that the B-24 broke apart against a ridge and was swallowed by the landscape. It is equally possible that the crew attempted an emergency landing on a frozen lake, which later thawed and consumed the remains. Without wreckage, historians are left to piece together clues like detectives. For their part, local Norwegian resistance fighters, the Milorg, were also expecting an American team that never arrived. In later interviews, some recalled waiting for days at a designated rendezvous point, convinced that the OSS had been delayed. Only when radio traffic from Britain shifted to new instructions did they learn that the operation had been reorganized. Still, none received confirmation of a crash or survivor. The silence was total. This missing insertion altered the trajectory of Operation WWII. Instead of deploying a larger force, the OSS regrouped and sent a second, smaller team equipped with better radios and a more reliable aircraft. This group, led by Colby, succeeded in their mission, blowing key rail bridges and delaying German redeployments. Their actions contributed materially to the Allied effort in the Northern Theater. Yet in official histories, their success often overshadows the unanswered questions surrounding the earlier attempt. From a modern perspective, Operation WWII offers a sobering lesson about the fragility of wartime intelligence. A single unrecorded loss, a vanished aircraft, an unnamed team, can reshape an entire operations design. It also reveals how incomplete documentation can obscure the contributions of soldiers whose sacrifices remain barely acknowledged. The OSS, operating under secrecy, rarely kept detailed personnel logs. When something went wrong, the record often reflected only the adjusted plan, not the initial failure. But the greatest mystery remains unresolved. No crew lists have surfaced. No crash site has been definitively linked to the missing team. It is a gap in the historical narrative that persists despite decades of research. Somewhere in the mountains of Norway, under layers of ice and time, may lie the remnants of a mission that was erased not by intention, but by snow, silence, and wartime necessity. And the disappearance of that team, silent, unrecorded, and overshadowed, sets the stage for another forgotten episode, one that unfolded far to the south amidst the rugged peaks of the Italian Apennines. High in the rugged Italian Apennines, where jagged ridgelines tear through winter fog and narrow passes wind like veins through stone, an almost forgotten U.S. Army mission unfolded in early 1944. It would later be overshadowed by grander operations in Italy, Anzio, Monte Cassino, the Gothic Line, but for the air crews tasked with completing it, the mission was every bit as dangerous. Known informally among pilots as the Mount Falter Corridor Run, it was designed to supply anti-fascist partisans hidden deep behind German lines. But what began as a straightforward airdrop evolved into one of the most enigmatic disappearances of the Italian campaign. At the time, the Allies desperately needed local intelligence. The Wehrmacht's 65th Infantry Division and several German Polizei units dominated the central Apennines, patrolling mountain passes and hunting down partisan groups that threatened their supply routes. These resistance fighters, often small, scattered cells armed with outdated rifles, depended heavily on Allied provisions parachuted into isolated valleys. Without ammunition, medical supplies, or radios, their ability to sabotage German convoys would crumble. To maintain the pressure, the U.S. 12th Air Force authorized a series of covert night drops into partisan territory. The mission assigned to the 64th Troop Carrier Group was simple on paper: deliver crates of supplies using sea, 47 Skytteran transports and returned before dawn. But the weather over central Italy was notoriously treacherous. The Apennines created violent wind shears, swirling ice fog, and unpredictable downdrafts that could pull an aircraft off course in seconds. Even the most experienced pilots considered the runs perilous. One flight diary from Captain Harold Stenwick, whose squadron flew multiple drops, describes the corridor bluntly: black as coal. Mountains waiting to sweat you out of the sky. No lights, no landmarks, only the whisper of the altimeter and prayers you don't clip a ridge. For the crewmen navigating those night skies, fear was a constant companion. The flight on March 2, 1944, involved 3 C-47s departing from Grosseto Airfield. Each carried not only supplies but also burlap sacks stuffed with propaganda leaflets intended to counter fascist messaging in rural villages. One aircraft, tail number 43 to 15,219, carried an additional load: spare radio components for a resistance cell near Mount Falter, whose transmissions had grown erratic. These parts were essential. Without them, partisans could not coordinate ambushes or report German troop movements to Allied command. As the planes approached the drop zone, the struggle began almost immediately. Weather reports indicate a fast-moving cold front descending from the north. Clouds clung to the ridgelines, erasing visual references. Radio logs captured strained voices as pilots described turbulence severe enough to toss equipment across the cabin. Despite the conditions, the first 2 aircraft completed their drop. Their crews later recalled seeing brief flashes of signal fires from partisans on the ground, small, flickering beacons that confirmed they were over the right location. But the third aircraft, 43 to 15,219, transmitted only a brief message: encountering instability. Holding position. Then nothing. The C-47 never reached its landing field. No distress call followed. Ground observers reported no explosion or crash glow in the night. It simply vanished into the Apennines, leaving both aircrew families and Allied intelligence officers searching for answers. Insight into the mystery comes from fractured documentation. A fragment of an operations log mentions that visibility reached nil and that pilots were advised to divert south. Yet there is no entry confirming whether 43 to 15,219 received the warning. A technical note in the squadron's maintenance file later referenced the aircraft's left engine running hotter than expected during pre-flight inspection, an anomaly that raised questions, but not enough to scrub the mission. Whether engine trouble contributed to the disappearance remains uncertain. Italian partisan accounts gathered after the war add depth to the story. Fighters from the Brigata Stella Rossa, operating near Mount Falter, recalled hearing an aircraft pass unusually low around midnight. One partisan claimed he saw a dim silhouette banking sharply before vanishing into thick cloud cover. No impact was heard. Days later, villagers reported seeing scraps of fabric near a ravine, but bad weather prevented a proper search. When Allied investigators finally reached the region after the German retreat, they found nothing: no wreckage, no human remains, no identifiable debris. Some historians suggest the plane may have struck a snowy slope and become buried by repeated winter storms. Others believe the aircraft veered south and crashed in an uninhabited gorge. A few propose a rare but documented phenomenon in the Apennines: downdrafts so powerful they can force even large aircraft into terrain without leaving an immediate burn scar. The lack of any confirmed site means all possibilities remain open. The reveal that deepens the intrigue lies in the cargo manifest. Several crates were listed only as priority, confidential. Their contents were never specified. Some later speculated that they contained intelligence documents or coded communications gear intended for a partisan unit closely linked to the OSS. If so, the disappearance of 43 to 15,219 might have involved more than the loss of supplies. It may have concealed the loss of sensitive equipment the Army preferred not to highlight in official reports. From a modern perspective, the Mount Falter corridor run underscores the precarious balance between risk and necessity in wartime logistics. Aircrews often flew into deadly weather because failure to resupply the resistance could cost lives on the ground. These missions were lifelines, and the men who undertook them accepted dangers that seldom appeared in public histories. Yet the greatest uncertainty remains this. Despite decades of searches, no trace of 43 to 15,219 has ever been conclusively identified. The Apennines hold their secrets well, and the silence surrounding the missing transport casts a long shadow over the next forgotten mission, one carried out not in the sky, but on the wooded ridges of France, where an intelligence raid would leave behind its own unanswered questions. By the autumn of 1944, the forests of eastern France held more secrets than most generals cared to admit. German forces were withdrawing toward the Vosges Mountains, but they remained dangerous, dug into ridgelines, fortified passes, and small towns that formed natural defensive pockets. Hidden among those ridges lay a web of communication hubs, field teleprinter stations, coded radio posts, and courier routes that helped the German High Command coordinate its final attempts to stall the Allied advance. To disrupt this network, the U.S. Army authorized a little-known intelligence raid codenamed Mission Timberwolf, executed by a small detachment from the 36th Infantry Division, supported by a handful of OSS-trained specialists. Their goal was precise: infiltrate into the Vosges foothills, seize or destroy a German signal outpost, and extract before dawn. The operation hinged on speed and silence. The 36th Division, battered but advancing through heavy fighting, had already captured towns along the Moselle. Intercepts suggested a weak point in the German system near a wooded saddle between the villages of Fraise and Enude. A small team was selected, 12 men in total, led by Lieutenant Andrew Caraway, a soft-spoken officer known for his fluency in French and knack for improvisation under fire. Among them were 2 intelligence sergeants trained in quickly stripping teleprinter machines of their coding rotors and tape reels. Their orders emphasized the importance of capturing, not destroying, whatever records they could find. Signals intelligence could shorten the war, and every scrap of German communication data mattered. But the Vosges were unforgiving. Dense pine forests swallowed visibility, muffling sound yet amplifying uncertainty. The struggle began as soon as the team left friendly lines, moving under moonlight through terrain blackened by mist. A field note captured by a division clerk described the challenge succinctly. No paths. Trees choke every approach. Enemy patrols unpredictable, sometimes noisy, sometimes ghosts. The men crept for hours, stepping around fallen logs, wading through icy streams, and ducking instinctively at every crack of a branch. They could not risk a firefight. Their mission depended on avoiding detection. As dawn neared, Caraway's team reached the outpost, an abandoned shepherd's hut repurposed by German technicians. A faint glow escaped from a boarded window. Inside, 2 operators tapped at a field teleprinter connected to a compact signals generator. A 3rd soldier checked the perimeter every few minutes. Caraway signaled his men forward. What followed was swift and brutal, a silent takedown with knives and suppressed M1 carbines. In less than a minute, the team secured the outpost. The insight gained from the scene was extraordinary. Stacked near the teleprinter were rolls of ciphertext, a maintenance logbook, and a half-assembled set of encryption components likely belonging to the German KL-42 system. One sergeant, flipping through the pages, whispered in disbelief. They left it all out, right on the table. But time worked against them. The men packed what they could into rucksacks: rotors, tape, incomplete message logs, and a small notebook filled with frequency schedules. Before leaving, they smashed what couldn't be carried and disabled the signal generator with a shaped charge. Then came the reveal, a complication no one anticipated. The extraction team, a separate group of 6 men assigned to secure the exfiltration route, never arrived at the rendezvous point. Caraway's group waited 20 minutes, then 30. Still nothing. With German patrols surely alerted by the sudden blackout of the outpost, they faced a dangerous choice. The team split. Caraway would lead half back the way they came, carrying the intelligence haul. The other half would fan out to search for the missing extraction element. Only Caraway's group returned to Allied lines. The missing team vanished without a firefight, without a radio call, without a trace. Their assigned path followed a ravine thick with undergrowth. Not an easy place to ambush a trained unit, yet also not the kind of terrain in which a patrol simply becomes lost. The next morning, scouts searched the area. They found only footprints, abruptly ending where the forest floor turned to rock. No bullet casings, no blood, no drag marks, no equipment. The men could have been swallowed by the forest, or by something far more deliberate. Speculation grew among the intelligence staff. A German Feldgendarmerie patrol might have intercepted them, quickly capturing the Americans to prevent noise and alerting nearby units. Captured intelligence soldiers were often interrogated separately from frontline POWs, sometimes so quietly that their names never made it into wartime records. Yet no German documents recovered after the war mentioned such prisoners. It is equally possible the team changed routes after spotting danger and became trapped between converging patrols. But without physical evidence, the questions linger. From a modern perspective, Mission Timberwolf illustrates the fragility of small unit intelligence operations. Success could hinge on minutes. Failure might never be recorded. The intelligence recovered by Caraway's surviving team reportedly helped confirm German frequency patterns in the Vosges sector, aiding later artillery coordination and intercept accuracy. Yet the cost, an entire extraction team disappearing into the wooded ridgelines, was quietly omitted from official summaries. The absence of closure remains one of the mission's most haunting elements. Who were the missing men? What did they see? And why did the Army's own after-action reports refer to them only as unreturned personnel, without names, ranks, or unit identifiers? As the cold winds swept across the Vosges that November, Caraway's surviving men marched on to rejoin their division. But the shadow of the missing patrol, silent, unresolved, followed them. A shadow that would deepen in the final forgotten mission of the war, one that unfolded even as Germany's collapse drew near. As the European war staggered toward its bitter end in the spring of 1945, a final, little-known U.S. Army mission unfolded with urgency and secrecy across the collapsing frontiers of Czechoslovakia. The Third Reich was disintegrating. German officers were torching paperwork by the ton, field units were dissolving, and Soviet forces were pushing fast from the east. In this chaotic vacuum, the U.S. Army launched a tightly controlled operation under the codename Operation Firefly. Its objective was deceptively simple: reach a cluster of abandoned German research depots before the Red Army did, and recover whatever documents, prototypes, or intelligence materials remained inside. But as with many late-war operations, the truth behind Firefly became tangled in missing cargo, incomplete logs, and a disappearance that has never been fully explained. The mission was assigned to a select team from the U.S. 97th Infantry Division, supported by 2 OSS analysts who joined them at the last minute with sealed instructions. The target was a set of workshops and storage bunkers outside the town of Pilsen, structures once used by German technical units linked to communications experiments, chemical analysis, and cryptographic equipment testing. Allied intelligence believed some of these sites held research notes that could clarify how German command and control networks functioned during their final defensive campaigns. Such information, even in the war's last hours, was valuable. But the race was on. Soviet armored elements from the Third Guards Tank Army were sweeping toward western Czechoslovakia, eager to capture anything of scientific or intelligence value. The Americans, advancing from Bavaria, understood that whichever force arrived first would control the last intact remnants of Germany's wartime research efforts. The orders given to Firefly were explicit: secure materials, avoid confrontation with Soviet elements, exfiltrate immediately. The struggle began the moment the convoy left U.S.-held territory. Roads were choked with refugees, families fleeing the front, displaced workers in ragged clothes, scattered German stragglers desperate to surrender to American troops rather than be captured by the Soviets. The narrow, muddy lanes slowed movement, forcing the Firefly team to weave through stalled carts and abandoned vehicles. One corporal later wrote in a private letter, "It felt like the war itself was pushing against us. Every mile forward was a fight through human wreckage." Upon reaching the outskirts of Pilsen, the team encountered something unexpected: the bunkers were not entirely abandoned. A small group of German technicians, exhausted and waving improvised white flags, surrendered almost immediately. They insisted they had stayed behind only to burn fuel reserves and disable generators. But inside the bunkers, the Americans found evidence suggesting the retreat had been surprisingly rushed. Work tables were cluttered with diagrams, code sheets, and broken apparatus. Filing cabinets still held research notes and partially disassembled communication components. The OSS analysts moved quickly, sweeping documents into crates, gathering notebooks, and tagging unusual equipment for transport. It was during this frantic collection that the reveal emerged. Among the stacks of retrieved materials were several unmarked crates, stored separately from the rest, sealed with heavy wiring and stamped only with vague administrative codes. Their contents were not listed in the bunker inventory. When an OSS analyst pried open one lid, he found smaller boxes wrapped in oiled paper, each containing tightly rolled documents covered in symbols, sketches, and coded annotations unlike any standard German military files. The origin was unclear, the purpose unknown. The analysts sealed them again immediately, marking the crates unlisted priority. By nightfall, the convoy prepared to withdraw. The recovered crates, more than a dozen, were loaded onto 2 trucks positioned at the rear. The team set off toward American lines, headlights blacked out, navigating by faint moonlight. But somewhere along the forested secondary road west of Pilsen, the mystery deepened. When the convoy reached its checkpoint outside the village of Stalovi, one of the trucks, the one carrying the sealed, unlisted crates, was no longer with them. No engine noise had been heard, no gunfire, no explosion. The truck had simply fallen behind and never reappeared. The immediate assumption was mechanical failure. Patrols were dispatched along the route, but search teams found nothing. The soft earth showed only faint tire marks that ended abruptly near a bend in the road, where dense pines leaned overhead. No debris, no oil leaks, no tracks leading into the woods. The truck and the men driving it had vanished as cleanly as if the night itself had swallowed them. In the following hours, confusion spread through the command post. The surviving truck logs from that night reveal terse, clipped entries. Missing vehicle reported. USSR patrols in area. Roadside checked. Negative results. Without evidence of combat, the disappearance left commanders uncertain whether the Soviets had intercepted the cargo or if the truck had been diverted by orders from a higher intelligence authority, possibilities that remain debated today. Modern historians note that the OSS, during the final months of the war, frequently redirected sensitive materials without informing field units. Others argue the Soviets, known for rapid exploitation of scientific sites, may have outpaced the Americans and intercepted the vehicle quietly. Still others point to the possibility of a navigational error leading the truck down an unmarked forest track where it became lost or ambushed by isolated German holdouts. But none of these theories have ever been conclusively proven. What remains is a documented gap, a missing vehicle, missing personnel, and a collection of unlisted intelligence crates whose contents were never cataloged. The disappearance was quietly omitted from post-war reports. Operation Firefly was officially marked as successful, its surviving materials transported, analyzed, and absorbed into the growing architecture of post-war military intelligence. Yet the unanswered questions persist, echoing through the final days of the conflict. What was inside the lost crates? Who diverted the truck, if anyone did? And why did the historical record fall silent at the moment when the truth mattered most? Thus, the last forgotten U.S. Army mission of the war closes in ambiguity and shadow. Not with triumph, but with a quiet gap, another fragment of World War II history lost to the fog of competing armies, collapsing regimes, and the relentless secrecy of intelligence work.